Hello and welcome to Biotensegrity Party number 15 of the second season. The Biotensegrity Party organised by the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive with our guest speaker Leonid Blyum, talking about the unreasonable effectiveness of cranial work. My name is Graham Scarr, coming from darkest Nottingham in the UK.
And I'm Chris Morita Clancy, living, loving, and playing on the Coast Salish Nation territory near Vancouver, Canada.
And I'm Susan Lowell de Solorzano from the tiny little United States colony of Washington, D.C. And we're here, it's my job to say, that it's our intention with the Biotensegrity Party to promote and share the Biotensegrity concept with as many people as possible, and to include you all in that mission. The Biotensegrity Party is an all-volunteer production of the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive. Hi, Steve. Steve's waving.
Hi.
And that's a nonprofit organization with the mission of educating and raising public awareness, building community in the field of biotensegrity, and fostering and forwarding discovery, research, and understanding in the fields of science, health, and medicine, especially as those relate to biotensegrity.
Thank you, Susan. I wonder if you'd like to do the toast to set things off.
Thank you. I would. Today, I would like to toast Brood X. Brood X is currently emerging all over the East Coast of the United States after 17 years underground. I had not studied systems science the last time they were here visiting, or well, they're here the whole time, but you don't see them above ground. We are now treated when the sound is coming in through the windows. Woo, 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 woo. It's like a constant spaceship right outside, and billions of cicadas are coming up, and people who were not here 17 years ago when they came and are walking around and seeing them all over are saying, wow, look at them all. And those of us who have been around it a few times, they're saying, you ain't seen nothing yet. So I had not studied active matter when they were here previously, and I am looking at Brood X as a huge system of active matter, and I look forward to it, and I wish you could all see it. It's really wild. So cheers to Brood X and to all of us and all of you.
Cheers.
Brood X. And they're delicious too.
Yes,
But
my son.
how do you spell it?
Cicada, C-I-C-A.
Yeah, I know that, but what was the Brood X?
Brood, B-R-O-O-D, like a group.
Yeah,
And
Okay. So
Yes.
that's their whatever the taxonomy.
Yes.
yeah,
And I was going to say, so my son said that he wished his mother-in-law was here from China visiting because she has so many recipes for cicadas.
Okay, that's a very pragmatic approach. So that sounds good as a starting point for us today. Graham, are you
Wait,
going to
Steve?
what's the plan?
So Steve had something. Steve, you were going to say
Yes.
something.
well, I was just saying there's another brood that comes every 13 years, but not as many. But this Brood X is unbelievable, and if I get a chance, I'll run out and grab you a handful and show them to you. They're just, they're all over the place.
Okay, but do
It's
you
like
know of
you
any
can't
recipes
walk.
of how to cook them?
They're online. All you have to do is go online, and they have a whole list of them.
Uh-huh.
You
I
can make
haven't cooked
sushi.
any yet.
Okay, this is all new to me. Let's go to Chris with our sponsors.
Thank you, Graham. So the Biotensegrity Party events would not be possible without our sponsors. We have Handspring Publishing in East Lothian, Scotland. They've got a wide range of authors and books available for movement and manual therapy professionals. And they produce as well a free newsletter, which provides details of their webinar series with Elizabeth Larkham. And I believe Elizabeth is there right now. Hi, Elizabeth. And Body Biotensegrity is the online learning platform that Gwen Cornish and I run. We are based in Vancouver, or part of us, half of us is based in Vancouver, BC. And we've got some exciting stuff coming up very soon. Hopefully we'll be able to get back to you on that next week. Meanwhile, you can check out our Facebook group. And the Second World Fascia Congress will be running a 3-day online event from Brazil. It's August 12th to 15th. You're going to find all of the links for this in your chat if you're here on Zoom, as well as all the sponsors. The Fascia Hub in the UK, they produce regular seminars on fascia-related topics. Integrated Biotensegrity with Lisa Babiak in Alberta, Canada. They run regular courses. Lisa is here as well. Give us a wave, Lisa. Excuse me.
There she is.
Matrix repatterning with George Roth. They've also got regular courses. George is often here. I'm not sure if he's here today. Artifact Pro
Yeah,
in
He's
Spain.
waving. Hi, George.
And they produce anatomically inspired tensegrity models. Pre-tensed in Holland. They've got a wide range of models for sale. Bruce Hamilton, he is a long-established tensegrity model maker. And you will be able to find the information for all of this on the Zoom chat. If you are here on YouTube and would like more info, you could tap something into the chat, and Neo, I think we'll be back to you there. Thanks all. Passing it back to you, Graham.
Thanks, Chris. And I'll just let you know that we have a team of volunteers beavering away behind the scenes, making all this happen. So just acknowledgement to them. And now we can move on to our guest speaker, Leonid Blyum, who's an advanced biomechanics rehabilitator and a mathematician and an expert on biotensegrity. And I think away with you, Leonid, you can tell us more.
And we can ask everyone to turn off their cameras so that it looks better on YouTube for the presentation. And then we'll see you back on camera for the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Suddenly people disappearing. All right. Share the screen. Okay, so, well, thank you very much for showing up for this event. And actually, my plan today is to kind of move a bit further into the ideas of the unreasonable effectiveness, right? Because this is really one of the key points that we want from, you know, the new perspective, right? So the new perspective of biotensegrity, how we can interpret the things which are sort of taking place in reality, and at the same time causing a lot of you know, stirring emotions and debate, and where apparently the sort of, let's say, classic or traditional conventional approaches to mechanics do not really allow to settle this debate. And you know, a few weeks ago I had this conversation on the unreasonable effectiveness of the light touch, and following that, I kind of looked further what other unreasonable components we face, and that was actually shortly after that was a conversation with the Brazilian group. You know, I don't know whether Anna is here or not, but where they kind of asked to surprise them with their you know, some subject, and I came up with this you know, the unreasonable effectiveness of the cranial work, and it was actually well received. So I asked the guys whether we, you know, we want to run it further and see, you know, the new perspectives and the new takes on that. So that's really where we are. And you know, my presentations are usually not very fancy, but at least they kind of keep me reasonably grounded. And I hope that that is what is going to be achieved by this particular purpose. Okay. So I hope the visibility is all right. So it's quite simple, straightforward start. So biotensegrity and the unreasonable effectiveness of the cranial work, right? So the cranial work is something which is really widespread, but at the same time equally misunderstood. So any sort of self-respecting osteopath is involved into that, and there are actually thousands, if not tens of thousands, of practitioners of different, breeds and colors of the craniosacral world and so on, which, a full disclaimer, have nothing to do with, right? So that's really a completely, I'm approaching this purely from the, exploration and understanding perspective. So I have no vested interest in that. So, and that's really what we want to explore. So my main motivation here is actually very, very simple, because there is this basic question, the sutures and the skull bones, right? The question that often and always comes up there. So is there something happening with the so-called cranial work, or is this just some mysterious placebo or some kind of just unknown, neurological effects taking place, but there is nothing tangible, mechanical going on? So that's really the central question. And so far, the debate has been around those things that, you've got the sort of conventional interpreters of the biomechanics, which would be claiming the basic sort of obvious facts that if you are dealing with the grown up, that the sutures are fused and effectively you can consider it as one immovable skull, right? And then there is another argument which comes from the camp of the craniosacral and cranial people who are trying to kind of indicate the room for movement, right? So there is certain displacement in which kind of small range which is happening, which is kind of justifying the whole thing. So the way that I look at this is that's just another limit case, right? So the same way as with the unreasonable effectiveness of the light touch, we looked at it through the lens of the scars. So scars being the ultimate kind of collagen bundle and fibrosis, which is obviously inextensible and which is obviously not fitting into the explanation of the myofascial release via sort of minute forces generated by the practitioners. So we try to explore what could be happening there. So from the same perspective, we are looking at the skull work as the limit case. So basically what we are doing, we are trying to explore the obvious impossible, right? And then try to find the new sort of avenues to understand it on the one hand, and on the other hand, not just to understand what's happening, but kind of to get pragmatic there and find the new insights there. So that's the logic. Probably we have to start even with that, like this, to get it tangible, right? To get it tangible. This is one of the kind of key questions. So for practitioners who are in the field and who are working with people of different ages, ranges, and sizes, and so on and so forth, this is really a very kind of practical question, which for any, normal engineer or the person with an engineering or say even conventional medical background, they sound like complete and utmost craziness. Like, how come that some heads feel hard, right, and some heads feel soft? If you were to experience that, you kind of naturally look in the mirror and ask yourself a question, like, am I crazy? Like, how come that you can knock on that skull and then, or you look at the, especially the dead skulls and say, well, like, how can I possibly feel that the texture is changing? Or is it for real? Because the sensation itself is so clear. And then, if you put it in a practical way, how come that for a practitioner who didn't apply any kind of major forces or just sort of planted their hand on a human being's skull, the grown up, right? Then suddenly, after that work, after those whatever few minutes or maybe 10, 20, whatever minutes of exposure, suddenly there is such a massive change in the mechanical sensation, which really feels as if the head became softer, right? Or if it was, the opposite, kind of having some, looseness in it, that it reconsolidated. That if you ask yourself these questions, that is really strange, right? And of course, the drive of the practitioners in the field who are doing that is to justify their action, right? Like, it's not a very nice thing to see yourself as a crazy person, but there is nothing in the standard framework of reference that we have towards the skull as the casing for the brain, hard casing, protective shell, and so on. There's nothing in that framework that gives you a legit reason to believe that the heads could be harder or softer, right? So in that sense, what happens, I just don't know how to switch on this damn Telegram, like it's just going to pop up from time to time. So so in that sense, what happens is that, you are facing this dilemma. You're facing this dilemma. You try to explain what's happening, and the only semi-plausible answer that people come up with is that, well, if I feel that it's being softer or harder, if I feel that it's moving, it must be moving. So there must be some sort of displacement there. And on the other hand, there is, respected anatomists and so on who are saying, hey guys, like, this is crazy, it's not moving. So if you try to measure, if we sort of put all kind of, the elastometers, dynamometers, or whatever, you see that we don't register any displacement. So that is a very interesting limit case that we will try to resolve, and at least, of course, not to resolve, but at least to explore and see how the Tensegrity perspective in the form of the Biotensegrity gives us some interesting insights into this question. So probably I can kind of throw a few words about my own perspective, right? So you see, I am originally by training, right? I'm the product of that kind of weird transitions which happened at the end of the Soviet era, when there's some experimental studies and university programs. So one of them was about the cybernetics, right? So cybernetics is a kind of the ultimate meta science which studies how their things are run, organized, and how they're comprised itself. So the famous stuff or prefix cyber, it's just comes from cybernetics, but today it's been mostly reduced to the computer science. I have nothing to do with computer science. I'm really bad with computers. But what we've been kind of focused on is how to extract those engines of the cognification, how the different things, how the different sciences, fields, technologies are made, and how you can possibly compare them with each other, and how you can transfer things from one place to another, right? So you see, because some of them are more advanced, some of them are less advanced. So what you're trying to do, you're trying to understand how the people extract knowledge in their own field, and how you can get this knowledge, this kind of engine of getting the knowledge, the cognification engine, and plant it into a different field. So that's really what we are looking at. So like this bigger context. And the strange thing is, or whatever, it's due to my family history, but most of the cyberneticians, they do something else, right? Computers, finance, whatever, economics. I just happen to move towards the field of the movement science, and they're trying to get it into the theoretical and pragmatic way, which obviously implies studying the body work and the physical therapy as an industry, as the field, as a kind of total branch of learning how the body works and how we can get the pragmatic impact on that. So that's my perspective. In that sense, as I said, I don't have any vested interest in any particular method. What I'm just trying to do is kind of to find a better, and bigger perspectives, which would help us to understand the things across different schools of therapies and across different schools and the techniques and so on. So let's get back to the cranial thing, and the particular inspiration and the particular reference for today's talk is going to be very much kind of aimed at the chapter 8 of Graham Scar's masterpiece, Biotensegrity, the Structural Basis of Life. And if you still don't have this book, I would once again encourage you to get one using the handspring discount for the Biotensegrity Tea Party. And, if possible, get more than one and start giving them to your colleagues and friends, because this is really a treasure trove. And the only thing is that Graham, he really like packed in a very compact way so many insights and ideas into his work that sometimes it's really worth an additional effort to kind of extract those super concentrated things and really like show how what he has brought there, how it's connected and how it, kind of links to plenty of other fields. So that's really what we are going to try to do today. So because in that sense, the cranial part, it's actually looking very mechanical, right? And in that sense, it's a good part for us to tackle this from the biotensegrity perspective. Now, you see here, I try to sort of go with the basic mechanics of what is the typical cranial interpretation. I was very, what I came up here, it was very polluted type of statement, which is polluted with multiple inverted commas, right? Obvious mechanical structure, protective shell of the brain. So, and this is really the first thing that I want to concentrate on before we even move to the cranial work. So, you see, there are so many so-called intuitive concepts that we kind of absorbed growing in the society that we have hard time articulating them and actually questioning them. So this thing about the skull being the protective shell of the super important and apparently mushy and vulnerable brain, it sounds like a helmet to the warrior, right? Who is about to be hit in the head. It sounds so intuitive, so obvious that we kind of swallow this hook at the very early age and never really question it. But the fact is, if we really think about what we are trying to study in biotensegrity, we are trying to study the biomechanics of life, and not any life, but the specifically in vivo life, right? Not the in vitro life, and even less so the in mortem life, but we really want to understand this transient flickering in vivo life. How does it happen that this in vivo life actually holds together instead of falling apart? That's the amazing part. And I really wanted to choose this reference from a semi kind of glorified and beaten up subject of the quantum mechanics. So, but not by talking about quantum mechanics specifically, but I kind of, I like the way that this guy explains math and so on. And he has an entry in his channel where he talks about the mind-blowing quantum physics quotes from quantum physicists. And it's not very easy to read here, but I won't just read it there. So for those who are not shocked when they first come across the quantum theory, they cannot have possibly understood it. So that's really a key phrase. And that's the most surprising thing, is that in that respect, that has to become our basic motto. For those who are not really shocked by in vivo life from the mechanical standpoint, that means that they just have not managed to understand it. They cannot have possibly understood it. That's a very important and very strong statement, because what happens is that everything that we start the usual biomechanics and kinesiology from it's kind of so blatantly obvious. Well, you know, we have that mushy brain. The mushy brain, it has to have, you know, a box around it, the box that is going to protect it. Isn't it obvious? Oh, wow. Yes, of course. Now we have the heart, which is, you know, our, you know, the source of life. We definitely have to protect it by the rib cage. Otherwise, you know, like anything is going to puncture it. So this kind of ideas, we take them as obvious and we don't question them. But the reality is that, you know, they are so obvious that we have to tell ourselves, if it's not surprising, then it must be wrong. That's really what I want to plant, and hope that you kind of just get a taste of it. That if the biomechanics is far from equilibrium, if it's the in vivo life, the magic of it, then any explanations that we drag from the in mortem machines, they must be wrong. You know, if we drag them and try to use them, they must be wrong. So that's a first lens through which I invite you to look at it, so that when it comes to this intuitive thing, oh, of course, this moves this, you know, like, okay, that's a mover of that. The biceps moves whatever, the forearm, right? Or again, the chest protects the heart, and the spinal column sits on the support of the pelvis as the base of the column. So this is just like a simple litmus test. If it feels like you want to say, oh, isn't it obvious? You have to slap yourself, you know, on the hand, on the lips or whatever, and say, oh, this must be wrong. And that's really the first point, which is the trouble of our entire field. The trouble of the functional anatomy and the trouble of the pragmatic anatomies in the form of physical therapy and manual medicine, body work, and so on. We are so happily going for the obvious. Oh, it has to be aligned. Yeah, sure. You know, must be straight. Yeah, sure. So that's a first point. If we want to understand what's happening with the skull, it's definitely not obvious. And that's the central point. What attracts me, or attracted me in first place, to the point of biotensegrity is that it passes that first test. It's not obvious. The conclusions that come out of the biotensegrity perspective, they take a certain chain of the hidden and the non-obvious reasoning. It's full of the surprises, so that you cannot just take your school course in geometry, you know, like, and by saying school, it's like a middle school, right? And as, for example, the range of motion concept. But you have to feel the nuances. You have to flip things several times before you're able to perceive. So that's really, even if we don't get any further, right? So you see, that's really the first stage that I want to bring here. So speaking of biotensegrity and taking the biotensegrity perspective on this entire cranial thing, so that's what we want to look at, right? It has to be surprising. There has to be flips and inversions. It shouldn't be just blatantly obvious. So, and in that sense, I would be talking about it, right? Is as a kind of umbrella thing, is that even though the skull looks like an ultimate compression thing, the helmet, so the message that I would try to explore there, or deliver and explore there, is that actually that's the case of the ultimate tensional integrity rather than being a compressive shell. So let's see how we get there. So first point, I really invite you to get better kind of pragmatic understanding and the deeper interpretation of what tensegrity is. And ever since few months ago, Maren made her kitchen experiments, I was absolutely like taken away by their simplicity and brilliance. Because once again, for those of you who haven't watched it or kind of missed it, I will remind it that it's worth reminding several times, like processing. It's like a multi-layered thing that keeps bringing the new meanings every time. So it's a very simple start, right? So she takes a 6-strat tensegrity model, which is worth 30 grams, like in terms of the weight, 1 ounce. And then she puts there 1 kilo of flour on it. And the thing does not compress. It doesn't really deform much, right? So it doesn't collapse. It just redistributes the loads within it. So my point is that it's something which is worth appreciating, right? Because you look at the structure, which has 30 grams of weight, right? So therefore, if you put it on, it's a reaction force corresponding to the 30 grams. And then you put the 1 kilo on top of it, 30 times more. And then later on, she put like 50 times more and so on. And the thing is still able to absorb it. So it absorbs it. So in that sense, you kind of see that there is this huge hidden 50 times or maybe even 100 times potential of those internal forces hidden inside it, right? So you see, if you remember in Graham's book, that chapter 3 talking about the hidden forces, right? Tensegrity being the balance of the hidden unseen forces. So that's really a very simple and elegant way of looking into it and saying, oh, if those forces are locked there, so how do we visualize, right? Via the loads which are then exposing that emergent redistribution. So effectively, it's like emergent stiffness. But then that's not all. Because you see, once we understand this, that brings us to the really key point. Looking at that example, we start seeing the difference. Tensegrity, and I'm not even going now into the strong definition of tensegrity as the superstability from, Professor Connolly, but I'm just taking it lightly, right? So you see, this example alone intuitively kind of and directly shows us that stiffness as of ability to absorb loads without deformation and hardness are two very different things. So, and in the standard perceptions, in the standard mechanics of everyday man-made life, or even their kind of inanimate nature, we don't meet this. We typically put it into the same box. Stiffness, meaning the resistance to deformation, and hardness, we kind of blend them and merge together. And then the compliance, namely the ease of deformation, right, and softness, we put them also together. So the thing is that what we are starting to see through the tensegrity models is that the two could be decoupled. That in tensegrity, as that tensional integrity amplified and reinforced by the compression elements, we actually see this example. That structural stiffness of the entire system could be achieved without hardness. That's the first important thing, because I hope that you're starting to make the first connections, right? Because in our example of the skull, it's a central question. What are we dealing with? Are we dealing with the structural structure which is tensionally stiffened, or are we dealing with the structure which is hard? Dead one is definitely hard, but live one, in vivo, is it hard or is it stiff? That's, stiffness as the resistance of the deformation as the redistribution of loads. So that's the question that I want you to ponder on, right? And then as we move further, right, I just kind of thrown in this, this graph from Humphreys, right? So Humphreys, when he from his big, article on the extracellular matrix and the self-regulated loop of the mechanical homeostasis as the extracellular matrix regulating the parameters of the stiffness and compliance by either up-regulating or down-regulating them. So that's my conclusion, kind of transitional conclusion here. So tensegrity shows that the function, right, function in the mathematical sense of stiffness is separate from the material hardness. So stiffness is a behavior of the elements that are not necessarily materially hard. That's a very important thing. So it gives us the stiffness without hardness, and vice versa. Compliance is separate from the material softness. Compliance means the yield, the ease of the deformation. So, but now we move to the next phase. There's another brilliance there in that arguments that emerged within that, around that video of Marin, which is called is a response to the Patrick Johnson's thing, debunking the tensegrity, right? So you see, hers is called the debunking the debunk. So now, the thing is that what we are looking at here, and just feel the difference. So what is the critique that an arrogant practitioner of the engineering craft is going to throw at us? The critique is very simple. You guys must be completely out of your mind, because once we put your 3 inclined struts into the free body diagram, namely open the kind of the interface, open the boundary of the system, then of course they are vastly inferior to the system which has 90 degrees struts as the support. So the point is that obviously we are aware about that, right? And now a central point is that tensegrity illustrates the system which has this boundary, the boundary which works as a kind of kinematic cloud, which is indivisible. And the 3-strat tensegrity is the minimal kinematic cloud, right? So you see, I want you to really appreciate it, because you see, when we put 3 struts, it's so easily countable, right? 1, 2, 3. So it gives you there kind of this illusion that you can just follow them and say, okay, now let's kind of disassemble it, apply, calculate the forces via the free body diagram at each of them, and then sum them up. No, that's a multiplicative thing that sits behind their nonlinear boundaries. That's a cloud. And 3 struts is the minimal compressional reinforcements that you need to get a cloud. The cloud which has a property of stiffness. So once again, I want you to really appreciate, because now we're moving to the 6-strat tensegrity. What is that? It's still a cloud, but it has more stiffeners in it, right? So you see those compression elements, they have the capacity to stiffen it further. Obviously, where am I leading to? That the property of the cloud that starts with the 3, it can go infinitely. So the more struts we put in there, And of course, that means that it would be also the cables integrations, right? The cloud property stays, but then this quality of the stiffness behavior and the stiffness boundary is just going to scale up. So that's really a very important argument there, right? Because when we will be discussing the interpretation, now I'm going to move towards Graham's book. When we'll be discussing his argument there, this is going to be very helpful for us to understand that you've got the tensional thing, and with the tensional system already capable of providing the stiffness behavior, plugging in more struts just gives our kinematic cloud better stiffness. So that's really the logic that we are going to follow. And another important thing is that when we are looking at this system like this, because of that internal load distribution, right? So the natural weight of the system is just having a kind of what in engineering is called, or is a kiss touch, right? So the touch without the load. So once again, right? So if this 6-strut thing is say 50 grams, and we can put 4 kilos on top of it. So the 50-gram structure has proportional reaction forces to the 50 grams. But our point that this is not a loaded structure. In fact, it looks like a 50-gram structure, but it packs the resistance capacity, the stiffness behavior potential of a 4 kilo structure, right? So you see, if I get the American thing, right? So the 2 ounces, the structure which has a 2 ounces of its own weight has the load bearing and kind of the stiffness potential of a 10-pound structure. So that's really an almost 100 times mismatch and the kind of the 100 times gain that is packed inside. Right, so that is really what I love so much about Martin's experiment, that this simple thing is actually kind of unlocking and saying, oh, how much is this, how much of those internal forces are locked in? Well, when we look at the structure itself without having this additional test, we say, oh, it's a 50 gram, it's a 2 ounces structure. But then in reality, there are 60, 80, 100 times more packed into it. So that's the takeaway before we move to Graham's thing, and that's what I put here as the locked internal forces. They dominate in this response, giving us 100 times potential. So, and in that sense, I actually want to highlight this thing, that when we talk about the kinematic cloud capable of the stiffness behavior, stiffness without hardness, this famous phrase that those are the struts, the islands of compression floating in the sea of tension, now it actually becomes much less poetic and much more pragmatic, that this is the internal sea of tension that is capable via those internal amplifiers and stiffeners, which is capable of becoming this, it's that potential for the true sea of tension. So that's really the entry point. So in more elegant terms, I would call that Tensegrity in that sense. It shows us that how we can get the structural emergent stiffness gradient without hardness, right? Because emergent, we didn't know that it exists there. It emerges only upon their interactions. And it emerges not as the just measurement of the stiffness, right? Because you can't measure that stiffness without the application of the load. So in that sense, it's a dynamic property, which is going to show us the gradient of the response, also depending on how we load the structure, with what kind of, what particular, impulses and impacts are going to happen. So as always, I got long-winded, but okay, I hope that it helps. So more struts gives us a more populated kinematic cloud. It's indivisible, and it's a continuous tensional integrity property. We start with 3, go for 6, go on, and so on and so on. So that's really the Tensegrity perspective that I want you to see before we move into this conversation on the skull. And now let me exit from here and move back to Graham's book. So here we are. Am I still sharing, right? I'm still sharing. Okay, so here we are, chapter 8. So first thing, what are the lessons that we're getting from Graham? In fact, it's very, very interesting, because the standard interpretation of the development of the skull, right? The standard interpretation, you start with the soft thing, the ectomanings and so on, and then in the beginning there's a growing brain which kind of pushes it all out, right? So it's sort of the hydrostatic pressure which pushes it out, but then gradually it becomes more and more stiff, and then it becomes a single unit. So what is Graham's first tackle? First, Graham is tackling the idea that you need, as a must, the hydrostatic pressure of the growing brain in order to create the expansion tendency. So what is he pointing to us here? Right? We started just now with we just covered now the idea of the 3 strats as the minimum, right? So you see that 3 strats, as little as 3 parts, is enough to give us the cloud if they have the proper tensional connections. So what Graham does here with his illustration, oh, my screen sharing is paused.
No, I have your screen. Oh, yeah, you're right. Now it disappeared. Start again.
No, now because I pressed pause, I see now I can share again. Yes? Sue?
Yes, now it's here. I see it.
Okay, because it just gave me the thing, but your screen sharing was paused. So that's really the thing, right? Is that what you see here? Let me try to. Yes.
Leonid, I don't have just the slide. I've got like the whole window. Maybe Mariana, if she's here, can. You know what I mean? Like I've got the menu at the top and the bottom and the side.
Sharing. No, he's sharing. I think that's a PDF that he's sharing.
Yeah, it's a PDF. Yeah, that's a PDF.
Okay. Sorry.
So you see, that's Graham's illustrations here, right? So you see what he did. He made 4 parts, right? What I'm pointing. So in that sense, what you have to see there is that once we are even from the 3 parts, we already can start the integrated loop. We can start the cloud. So that's what he's showing there, that with as little as 4, not to mention even the 22, right? So with as little as 4, we can start the cloud. The second illustration that he is doing here is showing how this thing can possibly work, right? We're not going to kind of dive immediately into the detail of the, tentorium and so on. However, what is the elegant thing that he is bringing in this thing is the first transitory step, right? Because people are often asking, well, how come that, your clouds here, those struts are straight, and what you are dealing with here is obviously not straight. So Graham is here to bring us the answer, right? So that in that respect, what's happening, the strat, technically speaking, is just the item that has a minimal length and tries to do the push, right? So you see, it tries to expand. It doesn't matter how it's shaped. So he brings this very simple examples that you can make the whole thing with the curved struts as well, right? So technically speaking, we would be saying that the straight strut is homeomorphic to the curved, right? Like the circle is homeomorphic to the um, square and all these things, right? So that's really like just basics of topology. And as we move further, now we move towards the hard and the soft. So what you see here, this is a brilliant illustration from Graham. He zooms in into the suture, right? And again, you see his point here, he is just looking at, like even the argument starts working even at the level of the individual sutures. So his point, if we look at that structure not as just a connection, right? But to understand that this kind of teeth-like orientation, if we take the layer, right? And that would be kind of across that layer. So like a sawn, like if you were using the saw to cut the ice, right? Like maybe it's a Russian reference, but anyway. So what he's pointing out here, that if you look at the way how the things are connected, and the red ones here, they are the collagens, right? And the blue ones, they are the forced lines of reaction. So he brings a very simple point, that if you pull it from side to side, right? So you see, if you pull it, as you pull it, that creates tension. So the question is that it depends on where you are in respect to the curved structure. That's a brilliant move, right? You see here, that's what he's illustrating, that if the whole border is curved, then all you need is to generate the tension in order to bring the expansion. That's elegant, right? So you see, in that sense, because this is a big change, you see, this way we kind of move to the point that we don't need the hydrostatic pressure of the brain as the only driving force for the expansion. We actually see that the moment there are sources that can generate the tension, then the system is geometrically optimized in such a way, or arranged in such a way, that actually we can have expansion without the expansion through tension, without the hydrostatic pressure. That's the first super elegant step from Graham. But then it gets better. Now, the next logical point is to understand that the grown-up skull didn't emerge out of nowhere, right? That it has the prior history. And the prior history is embryonic development. And that brings us to a very, very important thing, right? So you see, what we're going to discuss here is going to be both the technical part, but also this understanding, like what is metamorphosis, right? So the things that were present at the earlier stages of the development, do they disappear into the past, or are they with us in the uninterrupted fashion? So those primary properties which we observed in the beginning, are they still there? But before we do that, let's start with the obvious, right? So here is this illustration that Graham brings for the early development of the skull, right? So the membrane called the ectomenings. Of course, if we start moving into the details, there is also endomenings and so on, but ectomenings is enough for us, right? And forgive my simplification, we are going to focus on the essentials here. So what is the first thing? You see, if it was just a membrane, right? Because ectomenings, so far, it's a soft membrane. So if it's a soft membrane, kind of seeing it as a tensional structure doesn't really kind of bring much questions, right? Say, okay, yeah, okay. So we pull it, it's, it's organized like that. So it could be upon the pull, it can get the expansion. Yeah, okay, ectomenians. But then the natural question comes, of course, but then later on it gets ossified. So let's not rush with that. So what Graham is showing us here is this simple thing. So, and I'm going to simplify it even further, and I'm going to give the labels to the layers, right? So if we look at this thing, it has the outer membrane, it has the inner membrane, and it has kind of the in-betweens. So what he's showing here is that gradually there's going to be the emergence of those bone condensations. And that's how the thing is going to appear, that there's a growing bone front that is gradually within the thing which is going to travel to each other. Let's put the labels here. What will become the periosteum or become labeled as the periosteum? Let's call it the level 1. What would be labeled as dura mater? Let's label as the level 3. And what would be labeled as the bone? Let's get as the level 2. So effectively, our central question, if we get back to the understanding how could you possibly deal with the grown-up skull, is actually quite simple. You see, if we accept the fact that the original ectomenics is a tensional structure, because it's, and we don't particularly argue about this because it's soft, but we remember that it's not the softness or hardness that interests us. It's the stiffness and compliance, right? So that's the thing. So the stiffeners within the soft thing, that's the tensegrity. And my point is that around the entire history of this thing, as those growing elements of the bone, how we shall interpret them. It's a very simple interpretation. If we look at them from the perspective of what we've seen here, that's just, we start with the tensional system, which could have the equivalent of whatever starting number of struts as the elements of the stiffness reinforcement. But then, we just start populating it. So from 3 struts to 6 struts to 10 to 20 to 50 to 10,000. The fact that this first ectomenics is already a kinematic cloud which has its own stiffness doesn't change. So we throw in more struts into it. Well, the stiffness properties, they change. The ability to resist deformation improves, but it doesn't change the nature of the process. It's still the tensional integrity element. So you see, in that respect, if what we see as the process is the ossification within, right? So you see, that's very important. It's not the original bone, which then has the outer layer of periosteum and the inner layer of the dura mater attached to it. No, it's the original membrane with 2 different facets, and then you've got the ossification happening within it. So in that respect, this relationship 1, 3, and 2 is actually always there. So effectively, the way that we can look at the suture from this perspective is quite simple. As long as this original windows connecting the periosteum to the dura matter, as long as they remain, it doesn't matter how much of the additional strats we pack into the system. So from the compression point, it can be, as packed as it wish with the additional strats of those hydroxyapatites, right? But the sutures, if we start looking at them from that perspective, the sutures are very easy and straightforward illustration, right? So you see, that's kind of a more or less completed thing. So the suture in that sense is the window which connects the layers. So from that perspective, you can draw the lines. So extract, like wash away the bones, but it's the sutures that provide you with the integrity from the layers, and the sutures, they are the ones which actually indicate the tensional continuity of the thing. So in that respect, the whole argument is actually relatively simple. It doesn't take, like if you look at this as the metamorphosis, it's the metamorphosis of the system that has the, which starts as a kinematic cloud, tensional kinematic cloud, capable of getting the stiffness behavior. And then as it gets the insertions of the extra sediments, which is actually to a great extent driven by this tension, right? That would be the bone condensation. Well, the stiffness ratio increases. There is more of that stiffness that could be packed inside, but the original tensional integrity doesn't disappear. So it just keeps packing and keeps bringing up that stiffness ratio of the tensional system. So I hope that I'm kind of managing to deliver this well enough, right? So you see that you just, look, if I take this thing, right, and if I start tightening it, if I start adding tensional ratios into it, right, it becomes stiffer, stiffer, and stiffer. But for every stiffening ratio, if I kind of insert a crystal there, I get more room to stiffen it further. So it's just kind of moving the tensional system towards its ultimate maximum stiffness. So it's stiff, but it's not hard. That's really the central point that we can get from that. And what Graham is showing here is really elegantly that, you see, if you look at the history of this development and how the bone appears and what happens there, so then you see this is that sutural ligament. Right? So which is going to provide this permanent connection. You see, there's a process of tension and tension. And this presence of those tensions is the one that in turn causes their travel and the differentiation of the cells. But we're not even going to go into these details. My point is actually for this time, for now is much simpler. That in that respect, we never, if we look at it from the perspective of the kinematic cloud and insertion of that framework, just getting more and more and more and more strats for it as the kind of ultimate stiffeners, it's as simple as that. So you don't really need, because if you respect the continuity, the historical continuity, right, that it starts and then just continues, and then whatever we call as the metamorphosis from the soft skull to the hard skull, from the tensegrity perspective, it's not really a metamorphosis, it's just a smooth processes where you move your stiffness ratio just keeps growing by the fact of kind of self narrating the extra sediments within it, which become the strats. So that's just, as I said, is a very simple lesson that we can extract out of just the first half of Graham's book. And if we really start looking for it further, it gives us lots of the interesting things which are really easy to answer. So if we get back to this sort of standard question, right? So you see, we understood the kinematic cloud, and then we move to this central question, which we started from. Is there a movement? In other words, bones displacement upon the interaction of the osteopathic or the other cranial work, or is there none? The answer, it doesn't matter. You see, the key point, you don't need the displacement to be able to plug into that stiffness, into the system which has variables of tension. So because it's a stiffness behavior with the variables of tension in. So effectively, the whole argument, you don't need the statement of the bone displacement. You don't need the movement and the play of bones. You know, in that respect, whether it's there or whether it's not actually the critical part to the argument. The critical part to the argument is the prior history, development of the tensional integrity, and the continuity of the connection in that respect between the external layer, which is the periosteum, and then obviously or everything which is attached to it, the aponeurosis, you know, the fat, the skin, and so on, right? And the inner layer, right, which is the dura mater, which is kind of hidden inside the brain. So once you look at it like this, it's actually a very straightforward representation that the tensional integrity is there and it doesn't disappear. So, and that brings us to this central point: stiffness doesn't equal hardness, right? And then we can really answer it in a very simple way, that since we don't really need the measurable displacement of the bones in order to have the mechanical effects of the interaction of two tensional systems, so that basically brings us into this second question. So how can we plug into this sea of tensional system of the tensional stiffness during the cranial bodywork, right? So, and that is, you know, brings us back to the conversation that I had the last time about the metastable conditions and about the peridynamics, right? So the, you know, the presence of the so-called peridynamic families and peridynamic horizons. So where you can actually look at the gradients of the interactions, and then where you can deal with the, you know, with those states. And effectively, once you connect there, the easiest way to interpret, is it stiffer or is it softer? It's not the question of harder or softer, but the thing which is, you know, defined by that mechanical homeostasis is effectively, by definition, has a certain ratio of stiffnesses and compliance. So effectively, as a person who plugs the head into the thing, is really dealing with the head as the cranium. It's not the compression structure, it's not the shell, it's just being the ultimate tensional structure, which is most populated with the cloud of struts. So if it's the tensional structure, then effectively it's tension at its purest form, right? So it's in that sense, the dead skull is compression at its purest form. Live skull It's tension at its purest form. So it gives you their cleanest kind of tensional gradients. So where the micro of the mic, where you don't need displacements to experience the most of the emergent tension. And in that sense, it also gives you this idea that you are dealing with the transients, right? So in that sense, the only way to detect those transients is by being a comparable device, means another human being, because you can then stack and get this kind of peridynamic interaction and kind of plug yourself in from that metastable state. So the easiest way to look at it is that, yes, because it's a ultimate tensional structure, if you approach one tensional system with another tensional system and you are able to make the boundaries meet, then you're going to have the basic effects. It's like, you know, the tension always moves from the more tense to the less tense, right? Like temperature moves from the heat to cold. The same thing, if you are more relaxed, if you can meet the boundary without causing the bounce back, you are good. So then you become a tension sink. So you become a tension sink, so you kind of facilitate the tensional discharge from that particular tension reservoir, which is your client's or whoever's skull. So it's perfectly reasonable through your own tensional sensors to experience the sensation of what you would label as hardness and softness, but it's not really hardness and softness. This is this ultimate stiffness with the stiffness behavior with a certain compliance range around it, around that metastable state. So that's really, I think, is a very simple way of looking at the things, but it has, as I said, enough of the paradoxical components in it so that we can really interpret it in a rather straightforward way. And thank you, Graham, for writing that excellent book.
Oh, thank you, Leonid. That's put a whole new spin on the whole thing, and I've got lots of questions myself. But before we get to them, I think Jaap wanted to introduce something.
Yes, absolutely.
You ready to give your thing, Jaap?
Yeah, I'm in. Well, I want to challenge you with an observation that already puzzles me for many, many years. And that is that.
Can I jump in? Yeah, your sound is a bit fuzzy. Could you try moving your mic a little?
Okay.
Now say something.
Is this okay?
That's worse. Mariana, are you able to troubleshoot?
I think it's the microphone. So
I think the mic
Okay,
might be too close.
let's just do it. It's understandable. Let's go.
Maybe the mic is too close.
And
the observation is.
Can you make your mic a little further away from your mouth?
Can you make your microphone a little bit away from your mouth?
That's fine.
Yes.
That's
Okay.
better.
Good. Listen.
Also, did you want to share your screen?
No, I don't think that is necessary.
Okay.
I have a skull with me. I did already for 40 years ago an observation on sutures that I use as a kind of excuse when the questions from the craniosacral therapists come to me. Sir, you're the anatomist, and can you tell us, can you move the skull bones, yes or no? And nowadays I react on that question with, well, what is the meaning of the sutures? Are they meant to move, or can they be moved is a different question. And I found out, Graham, that the suture ligaments do not exist. It's a very common observation that we think that we have sutures in our skull. And you can see them. It are, in anatomy, we call it joints, but anatomists do not know that joints are not the same as disjoints. I always say we have joints meant to connect the skeletal elements, and you have disjoints meant to enable movement between the skeletal elements. This is the skull of a baby. And there you see sutures that are meant to move. You need them to have your skull bones glide over each other when you're born. And I'm sure that inside the skull, you will also see that sutures from the inside, which is no longer the case in the adult skull. What many people do not know is, here, for example, you look at the skull, this is the front, this is the back. So this is the famous, sagittal suture. But if you turn around, they are not there. And if they are there, they're at the most straight lines and never the meandering lines that they always draw in the anatomical atlases. The meandering is only for the suture on the outside. It's really true. Here you see the temporal bone. I hope it's sharp, yes. And again, there is that meandering, very typical sutural structure. But on the inside, it's not there. You know what that means? That the sutures on a cross-section are like this. And that on the outside, there indeed is something like a sutural ligament. But on the inside, the bones are completely fused. Now I observed, it's just, a random observation that I did on the dissection room, that it is common in old people. In the old skulls, apparently, the sutures tend to fuse and to create what I think is characteristic for the cranium, and that is oneness. Oneness is typical for these bones. Oneness is not typical for my limb bones. There, the maniness is meant to make mobility and to create diversity. So that's an interesting thing. I hope you can find any explanation. I never search for explanations. As a phenomenologist, I'm not interested in explanations.
Yep.
I'm interested in meaning. What could it mean?
I missed a word. So you were talking about the older skull.
Yeah.
Could you just say that again? Because a word dropped in there. So we didn't.
No. In the young skull, you can so to say tear the bones apart because they are really separated. There is a sutural ligament that enables the gliding. But here, these sutures are only on the outside of the skull. On the inside, you can see, sometimes you see them as a straight line, but most of the sutures here, look at the points here. The 3 points, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now on the inside, 1, 2, 3, 4. This suture is not even there. And we all know that this suture is even disappearing in everybody. When you're born, you have a frontal suture, which is absent in the adult skull. So even in the frontal skull, you do not even have a sutural ligament anymore. But in all the other skulls, there is something like a sutural ligament on the outside of the skull, but on the inside of the skull, there's just a synostosis, there's just a growing together. And here you really have this stiffened ligamentous structure.
Well,
Your explanation, Leonid, was brilliant. I loved it. Now I understand that hardness and stiffness are quite different features, and that the hardness is not the trick. But okay, what do you think of this phenomenon?
Sure, but there was George in the chat. He wanted to add something to your point.
Yes, George, do you want to unmute? I can't.
Oh, there he is.
Okay, I can read his question out, his comment.
No, he's okay.
Okay, now I can speak. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Indeed.
Okay, thank you. Can I share a screen? First of all, yeah, may I share? Yeah, okay, thanks. Let me just, okay, it says disabled screen.
No, you're good now. You just had to wait for me to catch up.
Okay, doke, very good. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so my experience has been quite different. I did craniosacral for years. I used to teach with the Upper Ledger Institute in Florida, and I just found that it really, I thought I could feel things changing, but there were other dynamics happening that led me to the understanding that the bones themselves, as we say, bone is fascia. This is a collagen matrix, mineralized matrix of collagen. And in my experience, these are significantly plastic potential changes that you can make in the actual bone. So I'll show you here, this is an example, a couple of examples of pre and post treatment for an infant with dysostosis here, before and after. This is just one treatment, really, that I did. It's actually quite dramatically changed. And these are changes that I can track over time. So just to illustrate the change in the shape of the cranium here. So the infant is one thing, okay? And I can measure neurological changes in hearing, visual tracking, deep tendon and pathological reflexes. We use another device called the brain gauge. Then in the other example here, I have an adult. You can see the deformation of the frontal bone here in the CT. And then you can see in this case, the pre-treatment, there's a depression here on the left frontal prominence, which after one treatment, you can see greater symmetry. And again, this is often, resolving many situations as well, like headaches and so on. So these are changes that I see on a daily basis. And let me stop the share here. Just, similar to what Jaap was referring to, if you look at, if I can you highlight my screen maybe, and can show you that. But if you look at the cranium from behind, this is a cast of the skull here. I don't know if you can see, but there is a prominence here on the left side of the parietal bone, and a good cranium will show this. And then there's a depressed area, and whoops, let me just hold it up to the camera there. Yeah, perhaps that angle, you can see it a little better. Yeah. So on the same side, I can't see what I'm doing now, there's a prominence of the lateral portion of the parietal and the temporal on the same side. And this is something we often are able to change, and things like tinnitus and hearing loss and so on are affected, and vestibular issues change almost instantly. So we can measure those things. But I just found, like Jaap is referring to, this idea of the sutures, there's been so much attention paid to that. I just have not found that they change, but the bones of the skull with light touch, like you were talking about before, can dramatically change, but it has to be very specifically targeted, which is what we do. So anyways, that's been my experience, and it's been attested to by a number of people who do this work, for, serious outcomes. We've had patients who've had like facial blindness issues that have resolved. Norman Deutsch talks about it in his book as well, but that's only because I believe that the fascia, which is in the actual osseous tissue, is changing. And the sutures, I think, have been perhaps a little bit unduly focused on as a therapeutic focus, which in my opinion are minimal in their influence in the adult, okay? Well, by the way, I have an interesting comment here. I treated a young lad who was 17 years old for post-concussion, and he had dramatic improvement. He was, his family is Indian. And one time, this actually led me to be able to do research at the local teaching hospital here, because I treated him successfully. But his grandmother was there one time, and she said in India, as soon as the baby is born in her, let's say in her whatever culture she came from, the parent or the mother or the grandmother would immediately take the infant's skull and begin molding it into a spherical shape. They would actually remove any deformities that were encountered during either gestation or during the birth. And I believe that a lot of these kids that have flattened skulls on one side are due partly to positioning in the pelvis, perhaps. I think this idea of lying on the skull and flattening it is erroneous. I think they lie on that side because it's flat already, and I can see that early in development. But there also may be meningeal tension that alters the shape of the skull, which I also have to address. But anyways, that's my experience. I just want to share that if anyone wants to ask or comment, or I appreciate your thought on that. Yeah.
Let me there's been a lot of data thrown in, so maybe it's time to get this data a little bit.
One moment, Leonid. Can I ask, we're now going into question mode. Perhaps everyone would like to open up their videos so we can see everyone at the same time. Thanks, Leonid. Carry on.
Yeah. Where am I here? Okay, view. What? I guess gallery view. Okay. So you see, look. First of all, right? So first of all, I want you to keep. It's been a fantastic conversation, right? So you see, let's divide them into the level. So what George was coming, right? So you see, like strong facts, obvious change, right? But once again, my central point, like even that illustration of that gentleman with the one session, the change of that eyebrow ridge. Guys, that's in itself, it's an amazing transformation, right? Amazing, mind-blowing, right? And I want you to appreciate this, right? So you see, what I'm kind of puzzles me, right, is that people, George himself, right, just scrolls through. Stop. This thing in itself is freaking amazing. And you have to stop right there. It's not to question. This is a fact. The very statement that, the very observation that this thing can change, it obviously questions everything that we know, everything that we assume about the compression structure of the bone, about the shell. The shell, by definition, cannot mold this way. And obviously, I don't see you applying mega forces there, right? So that's another point, right? So you see, and also this whole conversation about the Indians, they might be thinking that they are applying compressions, but my whole central point was, if you stack tensions, stack, it becomes the super stiffness, which still has the tensional nature, but it's densely populated with struts. But it's still being the tensional thing. So therefore, it's still a thing which responds to variation. So you can meet it with the, you see, what is the point about the tensional system? Tensional systems are open. You can put, there are sums, you can put two tensional systems together and you're going to have the exchange. They're going to be averaging, right? So if you have something very dense, something very stiff, and you meet the boundary, the system is going to re-enhance. You see, if I have hot tea and I put it to the cold item, it's going to be a flow, the average, therefore it's going to be a, the cold item is going to be a sink, which is going to take, it's going to be a sink. So the heat has to flow into the sink. The same thing here. So the central point which I'm bringing there, it's not about what particular avenues. You see, I was bringing 2 points. One point is that the cloud capable of system stiffness starts with as little as 3 strats. From 3 strats of any nature, you can have a cloud. That's point 1. Point 2, you insert more strats into the thing, your stiffness grows. And again, stiffness, potential emergent stiffness packed inside. That's a point 2. Point 3, if something starts as a tensional system, it always remains a tensional system. It doesn't become a compression out of nowhere unless somebody replaces your skull with a titanium plate. You know, if somebody removes your skull and then puts on the metal casing, then and only then you can make an argument that this is a true compressional thing. Now, whether it goes at the scale of the sutures, whether it goes at the scale of whatever, the main point is you had one membrane with the multiple, with the connection in between, and then it got populated, right? You see, in that sense, think of it as the ice field, right? You know, in that respect, we are questioning the point, is because if it's an ice field, then, or the ice plate, then the surface, and then you've got the water underneath, and you don't have the link between the surface and the water underneath, but because it emerged in a different property. So the same thing here. The main point is that those things are continuously connected. And the whole idea why people are so focused on the suture, because they still want a displacement. My whole message was, you don't need a displacement. It's so stiff. You don't need a displacement. You just, tension is transience, right? Transience. Remember the famous example of the tension range. So if you measure the spoke of if you stiffen the spokes of your bicycle, as you move it, the tension range measures it. You stop it, boom. You can't remeasure it. You can't replug yourself and measure it again. Tension gets stored. And in order to kind of deal with it, you have to get the peridynamic perspective. You have to connect it with the boundary of the system, which is going to have the manageable gradient. They have to meet each other, and so on. It's transient properties. So that's why we are not discussing here the particular carrier, right? So it doesn't matter. You see,
So,
everything that.
So, Leonid, wasn't this a supporting argument for your
Of course.
theory? Of course, say that then. Okay.
I am the person with mathematical training. I have to state all the steps.
Yeah.
Before I arrive to this particular statement.
No, I totally agree. Thank you. And can I just illustrate your ice analogy is wonderful. Can I just share one
Go ahead,
more
please, yes.
version of that? Because that is something that I also noticed. Let me just see if I can get out of that. One moment here. Here, okay. So this is basically the idea of a fluid compartment here. When you think of an injury, being applied to the cranial vault is essentially a fluid-filled structure. So the dynamics, the hydrodynamics in here also dictate how the forces are transferred. So as I mentioned, that cranium with the expansion relative to the depression on the cranial, on the parietal, superior parietal, also involved in a relative expansion. So this tension compression to me makes perfect sense, because the osseous structures, being fascial and tensegrity in nature, can absorb that energy to a degree, but the hydroxyapatite crystals, I sense, have somewhat of a slight fossilizing element to them, where they actually stay in place more than a soft tissue might display, right? So that's why bone is, I found, to be a unique structure in that regard. And that distortion here can result in mechanical stress that's translated into the dura, into the neurons, which affects neurological function, which is why we see often significant changes if these are resolved. Okay, so that's all I wanted to share. That adding that component, or the fluid component of the cranial vault, which has to be considered.
Okay,
Thank you, George.
once again, let me, guys, I have an even greater challenge for you. So for this, I want to share the screen. Let's say I thought about, am I going to put it in the beginning, or am I going to put it at the later? I will do it now, right? So you see, and that is going to be, we're going to get back to probably 10-year-olds. Let me do this. And I bumped into this example a few days ago, and I was stressed after that for a long period of time. Screen, oh, I didn't put the screen sharing.
I'll just say, for people who've asked questions, I haven't forgotten you, and we'll come to them shortly.
Yes, do you see it? Yes, right? You can see it?
Yes,
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 yeah.
we see it.
Okay, guys, let's do that. Aha, we're back to school, right? So 5 objects here, right? So 5 objects. Do we know their names? If we go back to school, that will be called trapezium UK, trapezoid in US, whatever is the reason for that, rectangle, rhombus, parallelogram, and square. So 5, forget the kite, 5 different names. The problem is that obscures their generalities, because geometric shapes, there are 5. But if we talk about the mathematical objects, then let's do this in the proper manner. So, which is the basic one here? It's, hey, it's
A
this.
square.
No,
No.
guys, come on.
That's,
This is the most general. This is
I see. Yes.
This is the trapezium, right? Or the trapezoid.
Trapezoid.
What is the condition for the trapezoid? 2 parallel lines. Now, how many trapezoids on this picture?
Yeah, all of them.
Thank you very much. So
You're
we've
welcome.
got 5 trapezoids here.
Yes.
But now, the next thing, parallelogram. It has the condition of 2 pairs of parallel lines. How many parallelograms is there?
4.
4. Right? So then, if we get the next thing, how many rectangles are there?
2.
2. How many rhombuses there? 2. And how many squares? 1.
Yeah.
So the square is the most, you take all these properties, right? So you see, we have, in this example, we have 4 parameters. Parallelism, 2 sides being parallel, twice the sides being parallel, sides being equal, and the right angles. So the square is the most special case of them all.
Yeah.
The
It has the
trapezium,
most limitations. Another way to put it. It has the most limitations.
it's the square has the, all the, if the other has movable parameters, right? So you see, what is a trapezium? It has one constraint, the parallel, but you can have any lengths, any angles, anything else for the other sides, right?
Yes.
So, and that is the thing which is completely destroying You see, even this part is messed up at school, because actually what brought me in, there was a week ago, I bumped into a blog of one Russian, she's an Israeli woman who teaches mathematics in some university in London, and she has 3 kids who went to English school. She talks about she talks about the teachers at the English school. So her child is like 10 years old. They went to school, and the teacher was showing them this drawing. And she was, it was a kind of parents teachers meeting. So she was showing them this and saying, hey, look at that. This is going to be this. Let's define those pictures. And this woman, she was sad. And she said, I really wanted to keep my mouth shut, because she has a husband who is also a mathematician. And the teacher, was like, look at these nice pictures and so on. And she said, I couldn't keep my mouth shut. And then I came to the teacher and she said, but you know that these are not 4 objects here, that trapezium has a definition. And the definition means that there are 2 parallel lines. And according to this, we have 5 or whatever, 4 trapeziums. The teacher was like, no, what are you talking about? What kind of definitions? What sort of crap is that? Probably you study this in university. That's the point. You see, all these conversations, right? For example, for me, this whole conversation about the versus.
Leonid, you're breaking up a little bit.
Yes.
Try again.
Yeah.
This whole conversation about.
This whole conversation. This
You
whole
were saying-
conversation is about, for example, anatomy.
Mhm.
You see, the problem with anatomy is that it's stuck in this school. It's stuck with the definitions of shapes, not the objects. The same thing. It doesn't, you see, when you understand stiffness and compliance, that's the highest definitions of the mechanical behavior. Whether it's liquids, gases, solids, mixes, whatever, they all report to their total behaviors of stiffness and compliance. So that's why, for example, this whole Bardoni thing, or the whole, conversation, I want fascia integrity, or we shouldn't forget about the liquids. We, of course, do not forget of them, because the moment we say stiffness and compliance instead of hardness and softness, we give you the most general definition. Rheology is in.
Leonid, into which more stiff and less stiff things all fit.
Of course.
Okay.
And that's where you have that definition of the mechanical homeostasis, stiffness and compliance, and you can have up regulation of stiffness or down regulation of stiffness, and you can have up regulation of compliance, and you can have down regulation of compliance. That's it. This equation, covers them all.
Just to be clear, instead of trying to figure out, is the cranium a parallelogram, or is it a rectangle, or is it a square, that exclusionary framework
Is absolutely misleading.
It blinds us from the unifying generalities.
From what is the highest generality there, right?
Mm.
And in our example here, the highest generality is a trapezium.
Great.
All of them are trapeziums. So all of them are fascia, right? So you see, if you wish, if you take the fascia as the umbrella term, bone, ligament, and so on, it's not rhombus, square, and whatever, right? They are all fascia because they have the same origin. The same thing in this conversation. If it was once an ectomeninx, the trapezium, you inserted some constraints into it and said, instead of these two parallel lines, we are also going, instead of the freedom of the other two lines, we're going to put another one, and now we call it a parallelogram. Well, it's a special case. And then you say, well, we'll tighten the constraints even further, and instead of the parallelogram, we're going to make those angles, we're going to fix them at the right angles. So we tighten the constraints further. But it's still the same thing. There was no metamorphosis. The primary property of that tensional thing didn't disappear. But you see what I found to my like complete and utter whatever is that, you see, I started looking online yesterday, and you see this is what they teach people. Even when they try to do generalities, you see quadrilateral is the general form.
Yeah.
And then it splits here. You know, they put aside the parallelogram and trapezoid.
Yeah.
That, but you see this one as well, this one as well. And then I only, you see, it took me 20 websites to find the reasonable one, which has the quadrilateral as the most general, right? So you see, which has all angles at 360. Subset of it is trapezoid. Subset of it is parallelogram. Subset.
So
and I understood how dramatic this whole thing is. That you know what are all the arguments? Of course, if the person has been trained that the trapezoid is a trapezoid and the square is the square, they're gonna beat the shit out of each other because they talk about shapes. But but the thing is that it's actually, it's, a square is a subset, is a special case of trapezoids. They just, because they're frequent, they're useful, they're whatever, they just get a name. And you see here, like, it took me also 20 other sites to find the word, to find this phrasing. Why is a parallelogram more general than a square, rectangle, and the rhombus? So I see that, in reality, we, even at the basic school teaching, this is already the level where people learn and they get the gold star if they've learned that the square is different from a, from a trapezoid, and then they carry this throughout life. And you see, anatomy in that sense, no, let's say I have the one who, like, again, aponeurosis has this particular, I don't know, what is it, 60 degrees angles between the fibers. And if it's not a 60 degrees angle, it's not an aponeurosis. It's just like, okay.
So Leonid, Steve wants to say something. The general idea is that our framework that we're looking, our lens, our framework that we're using to process this information distorts our perception.
Of course, what I'm saying is that, look, but tensegrity is way more complex concept than the quadrilateral family.
Yes. So Steve,
and if the person hasn't clear this relationship between the general cases and the special cases on this, like, trivial things, then of course it's going to be an absolute drama afterwards, right? And people would be.
So Steve's going to tell us something.
Please do.
Oh boy, I'm impressed. Well, getting back to it, the general is everything in the body is a tensegrity. What if all the fluids are tensegrities? They're all, fascia is part of the whole thing. So you're talking about, again, there is no fluid there is no liquid in the body that has restricted compliance. It's a tensegrity, and the tensegrity of the fluids respond the same. Live bone, and if you actually in surgery, you go and you take cancellous bone, and the stuff is mush. It isn't hard. There's no hardness to cancellous bone. It's mush. It only gets stiff when at death. But otherwise, the stuff is mushy. You just go and you just push it aside. Once you crack through the outer cortex of bone, you get to that cancellous bone. It's mushy stuff. You can just scoop it out with a spoon. We're not talking about anything solid when we talk about bone. Now, you can, when you get to the, you get some of the bone gets harder than the others, but the basic concept of bone is mush. So what Leonid has been saying is exactly that. I will also say that this whole concept of where the energy is stored in the body is, in my belief, is in the bone. You move through the tensegrity of the bone, and the muscles are, as I said, turnbuckles. They tighten up the system. So the movement is not from muscles. It's from what Leonid has been talking about in the bone. That bone doesn't have to change shape very much to store a tremendous amount of energy, which then gets pushed into the system for movement.
But
Does
you
that
see,
make sense?
that's why I wanted to get back to this, why Marin's kitchen experiments are so great. Once again, I will beat this into submission, like.
Okay, Leonid, we got some questions which really
Oh, yes, please.
relate
So
to,
just, yeah.
Can we get those in? It's something that Carol and Lesia, and also
Yeah,
myself.
I'm actually looking at that. Yes, I was looking at the question here, right? Or at least part. Okay, go ahead, please, Carol.
I'm putting them in because, yes, traditionally, the cranial concepts are considered bones as moving, and now you've presented a different way of looking at it. But no one's mentioned about the cranial rhythmic impulse, which is actually key to the whole process. It's not about pushing bones around, although that can be a part of it, but the cranial rhythmic impulse, which is palpable, it's measurable, and that's the thing that's really the key to treatment. So, and Carol mentions that we perceive the motion as the interaction of the bone with tension with our energy input, a synchrony of energies.
Okay,
well, how does...
you see, yeah, absolutely. Guys, you see, I'm trying to get this back to generalities, right? So the greatest generality we have, right? So you see that this is the whole, if we follow the line, right? So once again, follow the line. Amazing thing. 3 strats is enough to make a self-looped cloud. Isn't it freaking amazing? 3 strats, you can already make a cloud. Imagine you put 10,000 strats. That is how incredible of a cloud you are able to make out of this, right? So what is the bone from that sense? How would you make it? Basically, if you start dividing your original thing into and kind of bringing more and more and more and more of those strats, further splits within it, within the original cloud, your stiffness is going to grow, right? And that's the whole point. The bone is not a compression element, is the tension element at its ultimate stiffness. That's my whole point. So we don't need the compression. So, but in that sense, the good thing about it, the amazing thing about it, it's even more, right? So you see, that's what, because the tensional system reinforced by the compression elements can store, right, lock those capacities, which are going to be only visible at the additional potential external limit, right? Remember Marin's example, 2 ounces, right? 60-gram Tensegrity unit can hold 10 pounds. So the 60 grams are in reality packed 10 pounds. So the same thing, when we look at the bone, you know, when we say that the bone is able to hold whatever, 1 ton, that's not the material stiffness in that sense, right? That is that ability to be the spring that is capable, which is kind of packed there. 1 kilo bone, whatever, 2 kilo bone holds 500 kilos. That's amazing property, but it's a tensional property. It's a cloud. That's really the main point. And now, in that sense, it doesn't matter, right? So you see, the thing is that when you have two tensional systems, they can interact. They have a boundary, this have a boundary. That's the whole peridynamics. Peridynamics is about how you can connect them into families and separate them. So in that sense, it's, I mean, whatever school and whatever where people can have their, because you see, basically what you're using as those descriptions, they are to bring you in a certain state, right? So in the sense that that's the important point here, that this whole conversation is not measurable. It's because we don't have the tension tools with this same transients, which would be inanimate. The only inanimate measurement tools we have are compression based. So the best that we can do is limited by what those compression elements are going to, or material hardness, right? So you see, they are going to be in them, the hardness, softness, they are going to be indivisible. This is the whole elegance, that it's the architecture that separates the hardness and softness. Sorry, the hardness and stiffness, right? Stiffness compliance from the hardness softness. So that's the whole beauty of it, right? And that's why I will always invite you to keep, when you rush to throw some anatomical term, I'm inviting you kind of to think through and say, am I making an argument of a square against a parallelogram, right? Or a square against a trapezium. So what is a subset of what? And I believe that this is really the greatest trouble that we have, is that we've got people with immense capacity for their experiential recognition and for being able to get to deal with those transient responses. But the words which are provided by anatomy, they are incredibly poor, because in that sense, anatomy is, it's stuck at that level of labeling, like say, I have been the first to label this a coracoid process. I thought that it looks like a beak of a crow. Wow, I'm immortalized, right? This is silly. And actually, what I bumped into not so long ago, that Copernicus and Vesalius were published in the same year, 1543. It's amazing, huh? But Copernicus kind of undergone lots of the upgrades and the transitions, and Vesalius stays almost, let's say, almost in its medieval purity. The square is a square, trapezium is a trapezium, and they don't connect with it. So that's why I'm just trying to help in that view, so that we can see that we don't need to refer to this sort of old things, and you know, we have lots of room for this exploration of transiences and so on. And then, you know, like basically it's much more elegant than you know, the standard references imply. So, but yeah, okay,
Okay,
sorry.
Thank you very much, Leonid. We have another question here. I don't know if it's moved on beyond that. From
wait, so sorry, there was another question. So you see, Carol, Carol writes here that let's remember the struts in the bone, as Leonid and Graham described them, are not solid, but are forces responding to our energy input. Very good, because the next chapter of Graham, right, is actually talking about the chapter 9, is talking about the fact that the struts and cables are not fixed entities. They are situational, right? They can flip and change depending on the interaction. So that is probably another thing that we have to make, right? So you see, get the next level. So you see that this all depends on the interaction. It emerges through the interactions. Yes, yep, yes, absolutely. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, did you want to say something, or I'll move on to another question? No, okay. From Claire Coate, seconded by Eleanor Silverstein. Claire, do you want, if you're here, can you unmute? I can't see. Oh yes. Can we unmute Claire?
She can now.
Can you mute yourself, Claire? Okay.
There we go. Yeah, so you want me to read out the question?
Yes, if you still think it's
I'm
valid.
not sure if it's gotten answered now, but based on what Yap's information was on the lack of sutures on the internal side of the cranial bones, microscopically, then are there still those fascial windows between the periosteum and the dura mater? Or is it, I guess now I've come to the realization that because the bone is growing within the fascia, that it just permeates through base. Yeah, there's a bit of confusion here. So maybe if someone could explain it a bit more, that would be great.
Well, but you know, that's what I was just pointing out, right? So you see, you start, you know, like, again, we look back at illustration there very simply, right? So we've got this actor meanings, right? So in that sense, first thing that we've got there is that it not necessarily, you don't need the hydrostatic pressure to be the source of that changing extension, right? That was the first point. Of course, if in cases of the hydrocephalus and so on, there is additional component which throws in, you are going to have additional, you know, deformations, right? But that was the first thing. The second thing is actually indeed how we deal with this idea of the metamorphosis. And the point is very simple. If it's continuous, right? If it was tensional to begin with, right? If it was the stiffness ratio that it exhibited, so then the inserts of further inserts, you know, it's not even inserts, it's right. You see, it's basically the sediment, right? So you see,
Or
the sediment formation within it as those hydroxyapatites as the struts. That's just the stiffeners, further stiffeners of already stiff structure. So effectively, the main point here is that it's uninterrupted, right? So it's never been an interruption in the original tensional thing, as long as it's an in vivo thing, right? So you see, and that's my whole point, that we have to really remember that in vivo is amazing, right? That in vivo has to be anti-mechanical. So everything that we think automatically or that makes perfect mechanical sense must be wrong, right? The skull as a shell must be wrong. You know, the first thing, the moment this idea comes to your mind, you have to remove it. You know, if you think that, you know, the chest, you know, the rib cage protects the heart, bullshit, you know, because it's so intuitive. It must be wrong. So, and then you have, you know, and you say, you ask yourself a question, okay, it must be wrong, but I don't like it. I want, you know, like easy explanations. What is right? I don't know. But this must be wrong because it's dead, right? In mortem is not equivalent to in vivo. So there must be, the mechanics of the in vivo has to be different. The same point.
Leonid,
Yes.
a couple of people are talking about the concept of solid in the chat. And so I just want you to relate this to the fact that all living biomatter is soft matter. None of it is in the category of solid. Yes.
But exactly.
There are increasing degrees of stiffness and various alliances of strut functioning force management elements that emerge and are relinquished by the system as necessary.
Yeah, that's it. So that's basically it, right? So you see, that's again, we are looking at that. This is the, you know, the dynamic system which prioritizes in that sense, right? The stiffness compliance boundary with the outer world as a boundary which converts the external forces into the internal one, and the matter adapts to this interaction. So that's why it's the same thing. So dragging the solid, liquid, and gas is the same as trying to drag, you know, the squares and rectangles. It's the soft matter is a more general statement, right? It's a meaning that the soft matter could be, if you take certain constraints, it could be made hard, right? So you see, hard is a subset of the soft, not the other way around. So I invite you to get yourself
hard
back
in
to
the body. You mean hard in the body. Increased
Yes.
stiffness is
Yes.
a subset of the soft.
Yeah, I mean, well, but you know what I'm saying is, in general, you know, let's say we
Right.
talk about the range, right? So you see ranges. So within that range, hard is a subset of the soft, right? So you see, because we are looking at it from the stiffness compliance behavior part, right? So that's kind of where we have to get ourselves. Yep, you're going.
Would you say that
Ah.
more stiffness, the summit of stiffness is rigidness?
The limit of stiffness is rigidness.
And rigidness can appear as hardness and as bone. I mean, bone as the super stiffness fascia is bone. That's why a suture begins as, you know, a tension structure and may end in a non-suture.
Yeah.
That's
It
it.
is.
Right.
That's how it works.
Yeah, it becomes a non-suture in that sense. So
I have one remark on your everything is Biotensegrity.
Hey,
They once asked Goethe.
Yep. Bring that microphone further away from your mouth so it doesn't distort. Thank you.
You emphasize, you know, the simplicity of the Biotensegrity. Everything is Biotensegrity. Okay, I think that if you would have asked Goethe, what is the basis of everything, he would have answered polarity. So for me, Biotensegrity is a manifestation of polarity, and polarity is the basis of everything. God created in the beginning, heavens and earth. That's where it started with. And biotensegrity is one of the features of polarity. Amen. Good.
Well, but you see, this is where we deal with, it's that question of like, how do you get with the basic dualities, right? So you see, the way that I see it is that polarity is just another way. It's this is where we want to find the kind of the language which is going to allow us to deal with those dualities. That's it. But the principle in that sense is actually quite simple, right?
Okay, a question here from Kevin on that point. Are there any resources that we can use to dig deeper into this mathematical generalist perspective on movement? Where would you point?
That's exactly my point. It's hard. It doesn't exist.
Okay,
that's the drama.
You're
watching it being fabricated right here. The emergence of these alliances of concepts.
Okay, but Leonid, you got to where you are now. How can others start on their own approach?
I have to think, because let's say it took me, first of all, it took me like many years, right? Sort of, first of all, it took me 30 years to get there, right? And the second thing is that I naturally think this way, right? Like, it's just the way that I think. It's the way that I perceive the world. I always look for the special and general cases, and it's just it's a certain property of thinking, but it's I don't think that it's that difficult. So yeah. But you see, what I'm saying is that unfortunately we're exposing this trouble, because the other day I shared it with one of the people I know. I shared this kind of amazement, and we kind of got into an argument, right? Because you see, like, for example, the Russian school, it was based on the thing that even if you are 10-year-old, you are given a proper definition, like no easy rhombuses, you just get a proper definition. If you're too dumb to get it, it's your problem. If that causes your early alienation from the field of geometry, it's your problem. The field of geometry is not going to kind of bound for you and feed you an easily digestible nice pictures. You rise to geometry. If you fail to rise to geometry, your problem. But on the other hand, one might say that people with a different type of set, because in order to entice somebody into the geometry, maybe you have to show them those nice rhombuses and kind of this fancy triangles and so on, and say, hey, it's beautiful and elegant, you can draw those things, and hope that at some point they will get their interest in geometry when they grow up and they say, okay, what I've learned there was wrong, now I have to get the true understanding.
Can I take Kevin's
I don't know.
To a more general case?
Yes, please.
Okay.
More general cases are always welcome.
There we go. So Leonid's background is in mathematics. So when he studies biotensegrity, he learns about biotensegrity, he's connecting those concepts. However, Marin's got a lot of time invested in studying permaculture. Okay. Kevin, I think maybe you've done work in business. Depending on where we're coming from, the expertise we already bring, that we already have in all these other fields that we've worked with, and I don't care if it's cooking or martial arts or physics or whatever, dance, painting, you're bringing that to the conversation. Okay, so the more general case is, how can you help the rest of us find new frameworks, new contexts, new perspectives based on the world you're coming from. And I think we get a richness here because of that. Is that the more general case, Leonid?
I think so. I think so. But you see, also, you know, I wanted to say, right, is that because people who are trained as a mathematicians, right? So you see, these are the people who are more focused on the rigor and really they're like super attention to details, right? So you see, like the way that cybernetics is exactly this, is kind of in between, you know, like, so you basically, your whole message being is that how you can steal something from one field and bring it to another, right? So that's kind of this arbitrage of sorts, right? So, and if you see a field which has a very good cognification and then go to the field which has a very bad one, you know, that's your whole idea. How do you take better kind of software and shake off the material component which is present in this field and kind of transfer into the new field? So that's sort of the property there. And well, that's why I'm generally quite happy, is that overall, you know, like the language which we know, the cloud language and all these other languages, they really emerge, and then, you know, it becomes much easier to express this kind of concepts than, let's say, before. So that's really the thing.
So can I ask extension to that question?
Please do.
So really what I want to know is these generalities that you're talking about, is there a way right now to state them mathematically? Because I find usually for abstractions and generalities, if we use language to talk about it, it's really difficult to get to what is actually trying to be said.
Good point.
So just, even if it's very, very complicated, just staring at a mathematical function or a mathematical statement, I find is a better way, at least for me, to be able to understand those abstractions. And there's also, I do have a background in mathematics. So, yeah.
Well, you see, we can, you know, look, you see, there's always this tricky part, right? Is that what we are facing as a constraint is that there is also the thing that everything is kind of formulated in sort of second order equations, right? And we are dealing with the transiences of the higher order. So how are we? There is no good language to interpret it. That's first point. Then we also move to this next level. If we get technical, right? So you see, do we take ambient space, extrinsic, or the, you know, extrinsic manifold, or the intrinsic, right? So you see, how do we get this covariant derivative expression? It's just difficult, right? Nobody really worked that way to get that language where we are at, right? So you see, this is the trouble, and that's why I believe that Fuller was really the person who was onto something in terms of that, you know, his expression and ability to reflect it. In that sense, it's was really specific. But to tell you the truth, you know, I would be, you know, it's a kind of a dream to try to express it in terms of whatever partial differential equations, right? And kind of get it into the, you know, the tensor fields, how we get this going, hopefully one day.
Okay, thank you, Leonid. Well, we're nearly getting on for half past the hour. I want to say a huge thank you to Leonid, unless you want anything else to pop in to finalize.
No, I mean, you know, again, thank you for kind of, you know, for joining this conversation. And, you know, I just always, but you see, it's this discoveries when you realize, right? You see, like certain things you take for granted, right? And then this blog post from this lady about the squares and the the trapezoids was really such a like you don't think that this is possible. And I really, first person I think about is Mariana, right? So you see that. So because basically this is the whole trouble, right? Is that the moment you deal with the body, you start expressing the things in terms of you end up using the language of shapes, directions, and so on. And if that one is not very well articulated, you already then we very quickly run into the troubles, right? And I was frankly, it was since last year, this whole Bardoni thing, or when people talk about, okay, we will discuss, I don't know, biotensegrity, then fast integrity, and something else. Like, guys, it's like you're trying to make an argument that a square is different from a trapezoid. Like, yeah, that's impressive. But then this thing gets published, This is even more amazing. Instead of, imagine I'm going to get into publications, let's say the square is different. I mean, when you talked about trapezoids, you didn't mention the squares. I'm going to be kicked out of any places. Nobody is going to, ever, people are going to throw whatever dirty laundry at me, for being a complete, or rotten tomatoes, for being a complete moron. But in our field, a person comes up and says, well, this is a higher generality concept, which I don't understand. I reduce it down to the shape, and hey, you didn't mention the liquid. Paw. For me, that was really like, gee, guys, how come? This is so blatantly obvious. So you cannot use, the anatomical elements, attach them to Tensegrity and say, well, now I brought something. It doesn't work like that. So you either say, okay, there are all sorts of anatomogrities of all shapes and colors. As I said, osteotegrity, cutaniotegrity, ligotegrity, orbitotegrity, because there will be. But there's no such thing as fascia, fast integrity or whatever, like it's just, you're confusing the levels. So one big umbrella of trapezoids can have, rectangles, squares, and, let's say all that stuff. That's fine. They will be the special trapezoids of type 1, special trapezoids of type 2, special trapezoids of type 3, and that's fine, as long as you remember that. And you can give them my name, give them special names, but you can't put them into the same level. Then you are confusing everybody and yourself in first place. So that's why if you have biotensegrity, then you have all sorts of anatomogrities. By definition, they come out of there. But out of those tegrities, you can say, okay, if I want to divide it into the tissue specialties, I'm going to start with the beginning and say connective tissue integrity, neuro, myo, whatever integrity, or I can have the mesotegrity, ectotegrity, endotegrity, and then get all sorts of mixes and kind of get through them. So, but you have to really see the definitions and what is sitting as the set and what are the subsets, what is the generality and what are the special cases. So, and Really, guys, I don't know. It's just like it's been my discovery that the problem actually comes from school, right? And most people that we have in our field are those who didn't like the definitions, but like the shapes, you know? So that's a challenge. And, you know, if anything, I hope that our conversations will start bringing us closer to this, right? So kind of how do we, once we see this problem, how do we kind of, you know, how do we overcome that? How we, you know, get a better ability to do this, right? So you see, you know, yeah, this thing. So that, and again, I understand that this is just a different type of thinking altogether, and you know, it's a problem. And we now discovered that this problem actually goes back to school, you know, like to very early school.
Wow.
So we need to read Graham's book and kind of get it unfolded even more so.
Okay, I'm going to give a plug for Biotensegrity Trailblazers because we start Graham's book in book club next month.
Well, you see, you will never finish it.
You're welcome to join us if you wish, Leonid. Okay,
well, you see, if I join you, I guarantee that you'll never finish it, you know?
You're right.
Great, but you just say that we already did it. We went once through the book.
Okay, so, you know, it's worth going through more times, you know, let's say that's absolutely fine.
And what Leonid has said is greatly expanded it. My mind's just sizzling with all the possibilities and opportunities that arise out of this session in particular. Next week, we're also about bone. Susan, do you have something to mention, or?
Yeah, so the title, we're going to have Dr. Natalie Reznikov from McGill University and Hila Tsapora Chase from the In-Flight Laboratory at University of Montana. And the subject, I love this subject. If bone is the answer, what is the question? And that is a quote from Rick Huisques. If you have our newsletter, if you've subscribed to the archive newsletter, which I imagine you have if you're here on the Zoom, then you will have all the links for them and for even for the article associated with that quote, because it's an article from 2000 that he had written. So really, really great kind of contiguous connection with what we talked about today, which I love. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Susan.
All right, guys, you know, I say I'm out of my tea, so probably it's time to, yeah, okay, so there are people with wines. Yes. Okay, so.
Hang on, Leonid.
Right.
Wait, so, Leonid.
Wait, go for it, Graham. Can you stick
around? Someone to give a toast. So can you at least give the toast?
Leonid, you were going to do the closing toast, you said.
Graham wanted to do it. It was his chapter. So, you know, if he wants to do it, I'm happy to pass it to him.
Okay. Well, here's a toast to all new things, Biotensegrity at the beginning and more to come. Cheers.
Cheers.
All right.
Chin chin.
Oh, Chris, are you going to do the sponsors?
Oh, sure. Really quickly, we've got Handspring Publishing, Embodied Biotensegrity, the Second World Fascia Congress, the Fascia Hub, Integrated Biotensegrity, Matrix Repatterning, Artifact Pro, Pretensed, and Bruce Hamilton.
And thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone.